Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this ISDP-KAS webinar, the third and final in our series. Today, we're going to be talking about the Nordics and China's interest in the Arctic region. So the weather is getting colder, so it's the perfect time to move up north when it comes to geopolitics. And I guess recent weeks have shown that there's a lot of interest in the region. So a lot is happening. The EU published its Arctic white paper, which wasn't really well received in Moscow and Oslo because of the trying to at least partially ban oil and gas explorations. We have the Chinese sailboat incident, which seems to have been a bit of a microcosm for geopolitics and China's role in the Arctic. And then we have Finland, Japan, South Korea, and Sweden that appear to be teaming up on Arctic maritime security. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I guess today we're going to be talking a lot about the broader implications of China's and Nordic countries' interests in the region. So we're delighted to have three distinguished panelists today. And I'll do my very best to pronounce everyone's names properly. So first off, we have Gutbjørg Rike Haugstottir, who is a project manager at the Center for Arctic Studies. She holds a BA degree in Chinese Studies from the University of Iceland and an MA degree in International Relations from the same university. And currently she's a PhD student at the University of Iceland, teaching on international relations and security. And her main research interests include the Arctic, Arctic security, small state security, and Chinese foreign policy. Next up, we have Liisa Kauppila, who is a senior researcher at the Department of Political Science at the University of Turku and a PhD researcher at the Center for East Asian Studies at the same university. She holds 2 master's degrees in East Asian Studies and Future Studies. She lived in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, worked in China, and has been with the Bank of Finland and the Finnish Transport Agency. And she's currently analyzing Chinese company acquisitions in the Nordic countries in an Academy of Finland funded project, and is finishing her PhD thesis, which looks at the Arctic case study of China's global economic outreach. And last but not least, we have Adam Stepin, who is a political scientist working at the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland in Finland. And his research interests include Arctic governance, Arctic cooperation, regional development in peripheral regions, and the role of the EU in the Arctic region. Adam was involved in a number of policy advice projects for the European Parliament, the European External Action Service, as well as the Finnish government. And most recently, he's been working on the EU's environmental and economic footprint in the Arctic, as well as the Chinese presence in the circumpolar north. I think I'm going to stop the introduction here, and I'm just going to let you guys take it from here. So Rike, you would be the first one up.
Thank you, Larissa. And first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak today. To introduce myself a little, as Larissa said, I'm the project manager at the Center for Arctic Studies at the University of Iceland. And to introduce the center a bit, it was founded in 2013 and operates under the auspices of the Institute of International Affairs. And other centers that are at the Institute include the Center for Small State Studies and the Reykjavik Peace Center. So the Center for Arctic Studies takes an interdisciplinary approach, bringing together scholars from all fields and faculty of the university that are engaged in Arctic research, as well as collaborating and heading international research in the Arctic. And since its inception, special emphasis has been put on the West Nordic region, that is Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Iceland, as well as the growing interest of great powers such as China in the Arctic region, and also security issues broadly defined. But the topic today is Sino-Nordic Relations, so hopefully I will be able to give you some insight into the Icelandic perspective. And I would especially like to focus on the recent developments in the Arctic region when it comes to Iceland. So I will separate my short 10 minutes into 4 parts. I will briefly go over Iceland's relationship with China, and then Iceland's relationship with the US, and the 2 recent high-level visits to Iceland. Thirdly, I will discuss how the Icelandic population views Iceland's foreign relations, and finally, just a brief conclusion. So China-Iceland relations, generally speaking, have been rather good. Diplomatic relations between China and Iceland were, however, only established in 1971, which is 21 years later than with the other 4 Nordic nation states. And the relations have increased over the years. Iceland was, such as in Arctic affairs and geothermal energy, to name a few. And Iceland and China have good economic relations. For example, Iceland was the first Western European state to acknowledge China as a fully developed market economy in 2005, and was the first European state to sign a free trade agreement with China. And at the time of signing the free trade agreement, China had already become Iceland's largest trading partner in Asia. And we see an annual growth of around 20% from 2014 to 2019. I am not sure about the recent numbers simply because of COVID, and they might be a bit different. But when it comes to Arctic issues, Iceland did support China's application for observer status within the Arctic Council, and has welcomed the Chinese icebreaker Xuelong, or the Snow Dragon, which completed its first full transit of a Chinese flag vessel through an Arctic shipping route. And then when it comes to US-Iceland relations, of course, I'm not going too profoundly into each and every point due to the time limit, but Iceland and US have a long history, have a strong relations, especially when it comes to political and security relations, but also economic relations. So Iceland is a founding member of NATO, although Iceland has no military, but it relies on its membership within the organization for its protection. But that is also complemented by a bilateral defense agreement with the United States. And the US Army left the Keflavik Army base in 2006, despite the Icelandic government asking for them to stay longer. However, the bilateral defense agreement remains intact. And NATO membership remains a cornerstone of Iceland's national security policy. So there are 2 high-level US visits in 2019 that are worth noting, because during those visits, Iceland was pressured not to further engage with China in the Arctic. So first was the visit by US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in February 2019. And at that time, a US Secretary of State had not visited Iceland for over 10 years. And Mr. Pompeo said that Iceland would no longer be neglected, and that Iceland sits in a strategic place in the world. And he announced to the Icelandic media that Iceland was an important friend of the US, and he would speak to Icelandic officials about security issues. And he emphasized that the Arctic region was a security matter, and he would specifically discuss Chinese and Russian presence in the Arctic in that context. And the second visit was by US Vice President Mike Pence. During his visit, he stated to the local media that he was, and I quote, grateful for the stand Iceland took in rejecting China's Belt and Road financial investment in Iceland. So this statement took many by surprise, as Iceland had never publicly rejected participation with in the Belt and Road Initiative. And he made a similar statement during his short visit to Iceland during a joint press conference with the Icelandic Prime Minister, Katrín Jakobsdóttir. But Jakobsdóttir, she was quick to correct Mr. Pence and said that, well, the Icelandic government had not rejected the Belt and Road Initiative, but had still not yet opened up for it. The same goes with our Icelandic Minister for Foreign Affairs, Guðlaugur Þór Þórðarson, who also corrected the statements and said that they were not exactly accurate. And interestingly, the Chinese ambassador to Iceland, Jin Jian, said that Pence's statements were meant to interrupt and damage Iceland's and China's bilateral relationship. But until now, Iceland has still not decided on participation within the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would like to just briefly discuss what Icelanders think about these new developments in the Arctic region. And so there's a recent survey on Icelanders' views on foreign policy, which was conducted by Professor Ómarsdóttir at the University of Iceland with the Institute of International Affairs and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, if you don't mind me sharing. Here it goes. I hope you can see this. So respondents were asked to say how they perceive regional threats in the region as high, medium, low. And as you can see, increased great interest in the Arctic was considered high or medium by more than 70% of respondents. And they also see the increased influence of China and the US as a high or medium threat. But I do believe I'm saying, explaining this correctly, that in the report, Ómarsdóttir talks about that this survey was conducted during a time where Trump was president, and generally speaking, he was not very popular among the Icelandic population. So that is some food for thought. And then if we go to page 11 in the report, which is available on the Institute of International Affairs website, I think this is also worth noting when asked, should Iceland cooperate more or less with this group of countries in the future? The Nordics are obviously very popular, but here down low we see that China, US, and Russia are not as popular. Well, I think I will stop sharing for now, and just a brief conclusion is that the recent political pressure by these two high-level visits put Iceland in a rather tricky position. Obviously, Iceland would like to continue its economic relationship with China, but Iceland's relationship with the US is very important to Iceland, and especially when it comes to security matters. So I hopefully I didn't go too much over time. Thank you. We hopefully will have some time during the discussion.
You stayed perfectly within your 10 minutes. That works fine. Okay, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I think it gives us a good background on Iceland's position. So let's move over to Lisa, and I'll be sharing your screen.
I think I should be able to do it now.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I will.
Perfect.
Yeah, I figured it out. And yeah. Full screen. Is it okay now?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the chance to speak here today. My presentation deals with Sino-Nordic relations in the Arctic from a Finnish and also relational perspective. My presentation will be divided into 5 parts. I'll start with a short introduction, which discusses China's global vision, the role of the Nordic Arctic in it, and the theoretical perspective which informs my research here, and that is relationalism. I'll then discuss 3 types of processes through which China's influence might spread in Finland and elsewhere. In the conclusion, I'll anticipate how recent developments may alter the Sino-Finnish collaboration in the Arctic context. So I'll start with the introduction. The way I look at it, China's global outreach in general should be understood in the context of its primary node vision, its government's strategy to position the country in the center of the global economy. And importantly, this primary node vision is, first and foremost, motivated by domestic concerns. So basically, the Chinese economic development is dependent on overseas resources, and the CCP's legitimacy, in turn, relies on the government's ability to maintain growth. And then if the primary node vision is more of a blueprint that highlights political and economic thinking of the Chinese leadership, the Belt and Road Initiative is a concrete initiative that seeks to advance the primary node vision. The Nordic Arctic has been increasingly connected to this initiative, mostly because China is interested in building Sino-Nordic flows of Arctic-related knowledge, technology, and data. And then if we zoom in again, we have Finland. Finland is of particular interest for China because the country has global trailblazers in such fields as Arctic research, ship icebreaker design, clean tech, and ice management. This means that collaboration with Finnish Arctic actors can help China to gain knowledge, technology, and data needed for climate change mitigation and Arctic shipping. However, what sets Finland apart from some other Nordic Arctic states is not really the Finnish Arctic expertise, but our foreign policy, which is by tradition rather pragmatic and cautious. Although the Finnish leadership does not shy away from ratifying treaties and discussing or even tweeting on China's human rights situation, Finland has not been in the middle of such diplomatic storms as Norway and Sweden. Although some observers believe that it is only a matter of time when Sino-Finnish relations freeze over similar issues, many others find it hard to believe. I mean, Finland does not have the same moral superpower mentality as Sweden has, and we have a long history of balancing with a powerful neighbor, Russia, the Soviet Union, which has sort of made Finns very cautious and aware of the related risks. And then just a little bit about relationalism, the theoretical perspective that guides my research here. It's clear that for China to be able to engage the Nordic Arctic actors, it must be able to make others do what they otherwise wouldn't. So this means that China must be able to influence key locals to take actions that advance China's vision. And based on the core tenets of relationalism, I argue that it's not material capabilities that make this influence impossible. Instead, having good relations does. And from this follows that power cannot be used or influence exerted one-sidedly. It must be made together with others. And against this backdrop, we can actually argue that for China to advance its primary node vision in Finland, China must successfully manage Sino-Finnish relations, a process that has two components. What is China seeking to do, and how do the Finnish Arctic actors respond? And then to the actual practices. Acting out soft practices is one strategy that China seeks to advance in the Finnish Arctic context. Here, soft practices refer to using cultural leverage or, for example, leaders' charisma to pave the ground for more concrete economic collaboration. In April 2017, President Xi paid a state visit to Finland on his way to the US to meet President Trump. The visit took place on a year that marked Finland's 100th independent anniversary and the beginning of Finland's Arctic Council chairmanship, which, along with Arctic issues in general, was high on the meeting agenda. In conjunction with his stay in Finland, President Xi also met with the leaders of all major political parties and wrote a letter to the Finnish people. The Arctic was mentioned on both instances. These gestures ensured that Xi approached several key actor groups in Finland. And then panda diplomacy is possibly the most famous Chinese way of influencing global audiences. It seeks to associate China with something soft and non-intimidating, but more importantly, gifting pandas sends a strong message that China trusts you with these precious animals. You should trust China back in making decisions on collaborative deals. This is underlined by the fact that the current wave of panda diplomacy is characterized by gifting pandas to advanced economies with whom China wants to establish and maintain close ties to gain natural resources and insights in technology. The Arctic economies in general have been particularly lucky in terms of getting pandas, and the Nordic Arctic is no exception. It became Finland's turn to get 2 pandas in January 2018 in the middle of the country's Arctic Council chairmanship. Although it had been negotiated for some years, the actual deal can be seen to have had a direct connection with China's increasing willingness to bond in Arctic terms. And tellingly, also the Finnish names given to these 2 pandas were in line with China's Arctic aspirations. Huabao became Guru, whirling snow, and Qinbaobao became Lumi, snow. And then to the local response to these 2 practices. Certainly, Xi's visit was a very significant thing for Finns. It marked the second ever visit by a Chinese state leader to Finland, and Finland was the first EU country Xi visited in 2017. Although a visit by the world's most powerful man, as some headlines stated, would probably have been very important for any small country, I would argue that it was particularly noteworthy for Finns. To get this, it's important to understand the context. Finland is a country whose major national newspaper publishes a series of articles under the theme Finland mentioned, meaning that it's not at all typical for us to be seen or heard globally. And to put it differently, I would say that we are a country of 5 million people, and we don't usually think we can lift more than our weight. The same goes with pandas. Many Finns did feel special. After all, it's not very many countries that have received these animals. But at the same time, the response from Finns was certainly not only positive. Finnish presidential candidates were quarreling over Sino-Finnish relations on TV in the immediate aftermath of their arrival, with a right-wing populist party leader accusing the standing president of whitewashing China's public image. Op-eds and expert pieces in newspapers and more professional publications questioned Finland's China policy. Demonstrations were organized in conjunction of both occasions, meaning that not only the positive sides of China entered the news clips and reports, but also the human and animal rights discussions were heated up. In many ways, China's country image was and continues to be damaged by these two practices. To some extent, the media attention increased understanding of China, and what the people discovered was not always what they liked. And then the second type of practices discussed here are sharp ones. They refer to ways that seek to polish China's profile through techniques that Western countries often find questionable. Here I have two examples: imposing sanctions and monitoring of influencers. As for sanctions, we know that Norway and Sweden have been targeted very directly by China's sanctions. Finland, in turn, has largely avoided them. We basically have only one person that has been sanctioned, a former minister and a member of the European Parliament, Heidi Hautala, who sits in the subcommittee on human rights. Even she wasn't picked individually, it was the whole committee upon which the sanctions were levied in March 2021. In a similar vein, Finnish influencers, journalists, and researchers are perhaps less openly asked to check their views than what has been the case with Sweden, for example. Some instances have taken place, also in the Arctic context, but according to my understanding, it does not seem like a very much advanced practice in the context of Sino-Finnish relations. And the reasons for this can be many. The obvious is, of course, that there hasn't been Finland's Liu Xiaobo or Gui Minhai, so Finland hasn't been under China's radar. Another important reason might be the personality of Finland's ambassador for Finland, of China's ambassador for Finland. Unlike the previous ambassador for Sweden, the ambassador for Finland hasn't adopted a wolf warrior style approach. Also, the personalities of Finnish and Swedish actors matter. Perhaps there has been less Finns that report about sensitive and negative issues in English. Then about the local response, and this is what makes these more general Nordic examples relevant for the Arctic context. Inevitably, what happens in Sweden and Norway does get under the skin of Finnish Arctic actors. The fact that sharp practices deal with some of the core values of Nordic Arctic societies makes them, to my view, high gain, high risk practices. They can be a powerful way to persuade people to toe China's line and practice self-censorship, but they can also turn people entirely away from China. Researchers might be outright scared to collaborate with China, and companies might find it too tricky and risky. And then the hard practices, which here refer to economic leverage to advance China's primary node vision. First of all, developing basic infrastructure in a foreign country is a concrete way to advance China's primary node vision. It facilitates the China-bound flows in practice. At the same time, it gives China a strong bargaining position in local affairs more generally. In practice, financing and realizing the needs of small, perhaps less developed areas instills a sense of reciprocality. If you help me, I help you. In Finland, Chinese actors have been interested in investing in the Arctic corridor. The Arctic corridor would consist of a new railway connecting northern Norway's Kirkenes with northern Finland's Rovaniemi, as well as an undersea railway tunnel that would connect Finland all the way to mainland Europe through Tallinn. In addition, there has been Chinese interest in developing an airport in northern Finland's Kemijärvi. And the local response. Naturally, some local decision makers and business people have been very excited about the chance to develop these regions with Chinese capital and, for example, invigorate tourism. However, criticism has also been very vocal. In the case of the airport, the Finnish Defense Ministry blocked the deal. The dual use potential would have been obvious. And then with the Arctic Railway, the project has been very controversial itself, and the Chinese involvement has only added on to a larger debate. The two pictures here are from public Twitter and Instagram accounts of Suopanterrar, an indigenous Sami artist collective that has been very vocal in their criticism towards the Arctic Railway, as they call it, and especially the idea that it would be funded by Chinese money. The Sami resistance makes the issue a very complicated one, since it's a risky business for any political party to ignore the Sami stance. So basically, no matter how capable China is economically, in this context, it's unlikely that it can make others do what they otherwise wouldn't. And unfortunately for China, the mere fact that it's being connected to such a deal may turn out being a counterproductive thing, even if the Chinese investor company never truly planned to participate in the project. Then the final practice discussed here is company acquisitions. Chinese companies have acquired a number of Finnish companies over the past decade. Although many of these acquisitions are relevant in terms of creating Arctic-related Sino-Finnish flows, one of the most debated deals has been that of a Finnish pulp company that wants to build a new factory in Lapland. At least two Chinese companies have been involved in this project that started off as a startup of a small group of retired men. After some years of lawsuits, environmental permission issues, and complaints, the future of the project remains very uncertain. And actually, the Finnish side now argues that it was, in the end, the fact that there was a Chinese company as a majority owner that became the hardest thing to overcome. The other investors did not agree on a Chinese state-owned company having such a strong role, and the Chinese side, in turn, was not satisfied with a minority stake. Perhaps more generally, this case illustrates that in the current political environment, there's an increasing pressure to screen foreign investments in Finland and in the Nordic Arctic. The Finnish actors are certainly more aware of the risks, and more knowledge is currently produced to a growing degree at universities and research institutions. It's likely that building Sino-Finnish flows through company acquisitions becomes harder in the future. And then to the conclusions. Perhaps the most important message here has been that despite Finland's friendly relations with China, there are limits to China's power in the Finnish Arctic context. Negative perceptions of China are certainly on the rise because of what China has become involved in Finland itself and also elsewhere in the world. Finland's recent governmental action plan on China was very different from the previous one. It actually underlined the risks of China collaboration much more than in the past. At the same time, it's still possible for Finland to use the friendly China relation for the benefit of the entire Arctic community. This summer, in the middle of the EU-China disputes, President Xi spoke on the phone with President Niinistö and emphasized how Finland could use its unique position to enhance collaboration between China and the EU. As a response, Niinistö ended up promoting his idea of an Arctic summit that Finland would host by reinvigorating the spirit of Helsinki, an exceptional political atmosphere that Finland was able to create back in the 1970s in a meeting that marked a turning point in the Cold War. I don't know what the chances actually are, but perhaps something could be done together with Iceland, another Nordic Arctic country with a friendly China relation, and which has also done much to spread the idea of the global Arctic. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for elaborating on this. There's so much to unpack, but I think we're going to leave the questions for later, and I'm going to get Adam to take the floor now.
Yes, and I'd like to share the screen, which means that the other presentations. Thank you. And let's do that. And look. And nothing's happening, but something is happening. Yes. and I do this. And yes, I think it's fine now.
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me for this seminar, and I will try to give kind of a very broad overview of the Arctic Cooperation, Arctic Council, the Chinese involvement in the Arctic Council, and this kind of Chinese-Nordic relations or interactions within Arctic cooperation, and then also within the Arctic research. I will then start with this kind of Arctic Council involvement, and I was asked to give a couple of introductory words on the Arctic Council, which I will do. We'll talk a little bit about Nordic hopes and disappointments in that regard, Chinese involvement in Arctic research, and especially in this kind of cooperation networks with the Nordic countries, and a couple of problematic aspects. So most of you know, I guess, quite a bit about also our participants to the seminar know quite a bit about the Arctic Council. A couple of things that I wanted to highlight in this kind of Chinese, let's say, context is that it's a complicated sort of organization, and it's quite funny how complicated it has become over the years, considering that it's formally an intergovernmental forum, which is not based on any sort of legally binding agreement, and or it's this kind of flimsy loose structure formally. But interesting thing that Arctic Council does have is that it has permanent participants, so indigenous organizations, as kind of having this kind of very special status. It has observer status, and it makes no difference between state and non-state observers. So formally, WWF is as important as China in the Arctic Council, and it does much more than China. And most of the work of the Arctic Council actually takes place in the working groups and in the task forces designed for kind of specific things. And it's within these working groups, within the kind of concrete work, where they do kind of concrete work on assessments, on kind of putting together guidelines. This is the place where the observers can make the biggest impact. And when we think about the outputs of the Arctic Council, which then become kind of important from the point of view of observers, the Arctic Council has been really good in kind of putting together studies, assessments, guidelines, bringing together kind of knowledge, creating a sort of common understanding of what is happening in the Arctic. It's been pretty good in creating some networks, facilitating kind of development of new forums, and we have a couple of sort of legally binding agreements between 8 Arctic states that were developed within the Arctic Council. And so the idea is that observer states are supposed to kind of join into these different activities to kind of see what Arctic states and permanent participants are doing, and maybe contribute. There was, as many of you remember, there was end of 2000s. There was quite a lot of kind of discussion about how can Arctic Council sort of manage with having many observers and what should be their role. And they developed something called NUC observer rules, where they basically asked observers to contribute, maybe financially even, to permanent participants' work, to kind of actually contribute to the Arctic Council work, to bring Arctic concerns to global decision-making bodies, and of course respect indigenous values and traditions, and for states, quite importantly, respect their declare respect for their sovereign rights, and not ask kind of global community to adopt any sort of Arctic treaty. And for many observers, many of these kind of, I would say, requirements, or many of these rules developed by observers are kind of straightforward. Some of them are, there are some kind of expectations that observers would be doing something in the Arctic Council, something concrete. The problem is that there's a lot of expectations. You're supposed to declare many things, but basically you're nobody formally in this setting, in this forum. So the observers, I just kind of give from kind of rules for subsidiary bodies and for the role of observers, that basically thought making statements, you can propose a project, but you have to do it through an Arctic state or a permanent participant. You can fund the project, but it shouldn't be kind of majority funded by observers. And you can make statements. And now with COVID, you can't actually do almost like, you can't even really take part in the meetings in an effective manner because they take place online. So this is the context, you know, like every 4 years you have a review of observers, and there are all sorts of kind of requirements that for many states are actually problematic because there's not much visibility. You need to put a little bit of resources, especially human resources. And there's been quite a lot of complaints about it from the side of observers. When it comes to China, there's been from the beginning, as was said already, quite a bit of support for Chinese presence in the Arctic Council from the Nordic countries especially. The hopes were that China would provide resources for Arctic Council projects, but also that Arctic Council could be another space for Nordics to have like a privileged access to Chinese officials, just as they have to, to Russian or US or officials. And the other thing was that the idea that China could become more sensitive to Arctic concerns in its global and domestic policy making. And China has been definitely, that's said by everybody, behaving very appropriately in the Arctic Council, respecting the rules, making the reports. But actually, there's been very little practical activity when you compare to, to some of the European states, when you compare to the EU, when you compare to WWF, that the Chinese participation is hardly visible. We have a couple of projects, especially the Arctic Migratory Birds Initiative is a big deal. Also, there has been some Chinese involvement in things like adaptation actions for changing Arctic and the Arctic Council projects and Arctic observation. I will come back to this in 2 minutes. But otherwise, there hasn't been actually that much. There were some hopes that maybe during Russian chairmanship we could have some more involvement, but that hasn't happened. Interestingly, Chinese representatives are super active in observer meetings. When you have in Warsaw every 2 years, you have these observer meetings, Arctic Council observer states meetings, and their Chinese are very kind of outspoken and very visible, but not so much in the Arctic Council itself. The other aspect that was kind of problematic when China and other big states were joining sort of as observers were kind of the interaction of indigenous peoples, and there were some concerns that, that especially in the corridors, not so much really in the official meetings, but in the corridors where you have these kind of discussions between where the indigenous peoples could have access directly to Arctic states officials. There was this kind of concern that you would have problems, that you wouldn't have that access so much because of the presence of these big boys like China and India, that they would kind of take the floor. But that apparently hasn't happened so much, and China hasn't really kind of reached out to indigenous people before it got this observer status also, compared to, for example, Singapore, that was kind of doing all sorts of initiatives, invited people to Singapore, showcasing what Singapore can kind of give to the Arctic. And there's also been very interaction afterwards. Like, for example, you could imagine that China could be quite active with, now it's organizing CBD, Conference of Parties. So it could kind of support Arctic indigenous peoples in that regard. And I was trying to check, I haven't found anything in that regard, but perhaps it's too early to say. And then we should kind of also think whether that's something I'm interested in when it comes to the EU, and I also kind of looked at it kind of in China's from the Chinese perspective, whether we have this kind of process that becoming an observer in the Arctic Council, becoming kind of more exposed to Arctic matters, makes you more sensitive to Arctic issues, and you can kind of, that reflects on your internal and external activities. So there seems to be at least one area of success where China just a couple of years ago introduced protection for coastal mudfloods, which are very important for migratory birds on their kind of flyby ways. And actually, the Chinese officials cite directly the concerns coming about the Arctic birds from the Arctic Council as one of the reasons for adopting this policy. I think it's a very concrete thing, small thing, but I think it's an important thing. A failure there was the black carbon aspect, where it was this hope that Arctic Council starts work on black carbon and invites sort of observer states to kind of partake in the reporting. Some observers have been doing that quite well, but China has not. And of course, the explanation is that it's just impossible to get that sort of data, and there's so much anyway going on about air quality in China that this is kind of this is just not possible for Chinese to provide the data that Arctic Council would like to have. And that brings us to the kind of Chinese Nordic Arctic Research Cooperation aspect. So we definitely have in the Chinese Arctic policy documents for 2018 clear connection between the interest in the Arctic and especially Arctic research on climate change and the linkages between the climate change in the Arctic and how it affects Asia, how it affects China, and that's important for agriculture. That's important for weather patterns. So there is a kind of, I think it's a genuine thing. I think it's a genuine concern, not only kind of justification for being interested. And when we think about Chinese Arctic research, of course, what comes to mind is what was already mentioned. The Polar Research Institute of China was established in end of 80s. China, it has joined the International Arctic Science Committee. Most activities are in the Antarctic, but there's been more and more in the Arctic. We had like 12 this kind of Arctic expeditions. First with Huelong, and then now with like the new icebreaker that was designed partly by Finnish company, obviously. And we have activities dealing with sea monitoring, marine ice, atmosphere, now microplastics and ocean acidifications need to kind of come up in this Chinese research activities. The other thing that comes up when you think about Chinese kind of involvement is that obviously China has a Yellow River research station in New Ålesund in Svalbard. But two things I think are kind of interesting to focus in this Nordic context is one is the involvement of China in Arctic monitoring and observation. It's quite important that Arctic states and other actors, especially research institutes, would like to have as many people on board as possible when it comes to creating like a sustainable system of systems for Arctic observation, so that we have long data chains, that we have a lot of data available. So everybody's kind of welcome and invited, and all the data and making this data more interoperable, making the whole kind of system more accessible is something that everybody strives for, and people want to have China involved. And China has been involved, the PRIC has been involved in sustaining Arctic observing networks kind of projects. Also, the Institute for Remote Sensing and Digital Earth of China has been involved in one of the EU projects on observation in Taros. And we have also like kind of inputs for Svalbard observing system for other projects. And I think this is quite important, especially these Chinese expeditions. When you think about this, they allow they do bring data that is otherwise not available when it comes to kind of checking the satellite data with the surface data from the Arctic Ocean. We have so little data about Arctic Ocean. And then we have this kind of third pole, Arctic connection. And there you have this kind of typical equation that we will see everywhere, that Nordic glaciological expertise plus Chinese resources kind of brought together allow to kind of develop cooperation. And the important thing here is it's not only about Chinese resources in terms of money, but actually there's quite a lot of great Chinese researchers, like really great smart guys who are actually contributing to this kind of glaciological expertise. And I think this is important to note. And a problematic aspect has been of course, and I will not dwell on this, has been, of course, the different types of satellite center stations. In Iceland and in Finland, we have cooperation with Finnish Meteorological Institute. In Kiruna, there is a Chinese satellite station. And there has been a lot of discussion about it. We had quite alarmistic reports from Swedish, from Danish defense intelligence agencies about those. Some projects were cancelled, as Lisa mentioned, the Finnish case. Also, the Sweden Space Corporation actually cancelled this contract with Chinese partners about access to satellites. There's also a special format for Nordic cooperation on Nordic Chinese cooperation on Arctic research. The China Nordic Arctic Research Center, and that this has been going a little bit through problematic sort of period because of the COVID and also because it's focused greatly on social science, and Xi government is not as excited about social science as about other aspects. However, it has had quite successful fellowship program, and there have been kind of this symposia organized every now and then, which I think create good kind of case for networking. China has been also involved in Arctic science ministerial meetings. So that's another kind of area of where Chinese kind of institutions have access and can actually tell what they need from Chinese research. And just to sum up, I just noticed time over time. So just to sum up, so when it comes to Arctic cooperation, Arctic research, I think we have to see that there's always kind of this idea that on one hand we have concrete inputs that everybody wants, and we also have science diplomacy aspect that both Nordics and China actually want to use research and Arctic Council as science diplomacy tool. The level of suspicion and mistrust has been gradually rising especially over the last 3-4 years, and it also affects these technical areas of cooperation. I think that when it comes to Arctic cooperation, especially Arctic Council, the Nordic hopes for Chinese engagement so far haven't been really fulfilled, and let's see what happens in the future. Maybe Chinese will become more involved, more kind of practically involved in the Arctic cooperation, and I think there is a bit of kind of uncertain future following COVID and this Chinese assertive foreign policy and US pressures. We always thought that Arctic kind of Council and Arctic research are kind of the safe spaces for cooperation, even if there are kind of broader tensions. So I guess this should be possible in the future. But I think one thing that is definitely problematic are kind of independent Chinese research infrastructures within the Nordic territories. I think this seems to be a no-go for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very enlightening presentation. I think there's a lot that we can talk about. So before I open the floor to questions from the audience, I'm just going to seize the moment and ask a question myself. I mentioned in my introduction that there's this new mini-lateral grouping of Finland, Sweden, South Korea, and Japan. Could you guys elaborate on the role of smaller groupings within this whole Arctic security issue? Is it going to complement the Arctic Council, or is it going to be counterproductive for the Arctic Council as an institution? Or what's your take on this kind of groupings, if so to speak? Anyone wants to start? Yeah. Lisa?
I'll be happy to say a few words. I think that's a very good question and something that I've been thinking myself quite a bit lately. I personally think that they're complementary and they pose no threat to the Arctic Council, or I would say that since so many states are becoming interested in the Arctic and so many states have the right to get their voice heard as well, because Arctic issues are global issues, I think it's good to be able to sort of formulate these groups that sort of separate you from the big mass and give you a chance to sort of discuss these topics in a more intimate setting, and then there just needs to be a needs to be a way to sort of incorporate these groupings into the whole big Arctic governance itself. Yeah.
Adam or Rike, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would just say that, you know, like it's always been like this, that Arctic Council has been like a part of the much bigger picture, and the Arctic states themselves deal with certain things separately, like kind of outside the Arctic Council, and there is like Arctic Council is not dealing with Arctic fisheries, for example. So it's kind of obvious that it's pretty obvious that there are also other formats for other issues that are possible to be accommodated, and I don't see a risk.
Rike, maybe a follow-up for you. I mean, Iceland is not part of this. Do you think it has to do with their position on the US, or what do you think is, or was it just did it just happen this way? Do you think the Icelandic government was just not interested, or?
Honestly, I don't know. I think I would have to read more about this and ask around before I give you a good answer.
But speaking of the US generally, what's the pressures that Nordic countries might face with the US being more prominent, and you see there was a recent announcement that they're going to train with the Canadians on Arctic security. So what's the US's role? What's Washington doing? And how could this affect Nordic-China relations in the Arctic? Anyone?
I'm thinking that I think we as Arctic researchers are being approached by both sides in this Arctic context. So I've sort of noticed that the US is reaching out, China is reaching out in different ways. So you kind of need to know where you stand, and especially as a Finn or as an Icelander, you need to sort of find a good balance, because you don't really want to be choosing sides. But also one concrete example are the sanctions. Now that the US has imposed sanctions on China, that might have an effect on the way Finnish or other Nordic companies can sort of practice business with Chinese companies. So if the US has listed a certain Chinese company that would, for example, have something to do in the Arctic context, then the Finnish or the other Nordic companies cannot really collaborate with that company. So you're kind of, even there, you need to choose your side, because you're either with those who impose the sanctions or who don't. So it's hard to find a middle ground there.
Just a short note, I think for Iceland, US interest is welcome. As I mentioned, the US and Iceland have been strong partners for over the years. However, Iceland would still like to maintain its economic relationship with China. So it's a balance.
You know, and I think it's also like just a question of I don't know, it's a reputational question. It's a question of also of sort of public image, that a lot of projects that has changed definitely in a couple of years. Like I think with Lisa, we were involved in this report on kind of this kind of Chinese presence in the Arctic, and especially in the Finnish context. And when you sort of read in 2016, 2015, the interviews with people, I think it's much more open that, you know, we want kind of to have Chinese investment. We want to have Chinese presence. While a couple of years later, you still want, but you're trying to present your projects as not being primarily sort of kind of projects that are linked to China or linked to Belt and Road Initiative. And it's not only one thing that we have to remember in the Nordic context, and I think maybe even more so in Finnish context than Swedish one, is that there is also, it's not only US now that is kind of, this is much more visible and vocal, but also in Brussels, you have concerns about too big Chinese presence in certain member states. We have this review of strategic investments kind of framework developing that has been developed. It hasn't appeared for no reason. So, for example, like this. We had this discussion about this Arctic Railway, which seems to be dead for some decades. It will come back, but at least for some decades. And there was a point when they were really kind of the proponents of this were really trying to make a point that this is a European project. This is not a Chinese project. This is a European project. It benefits the EU mostly. And I think this is also this is something that has changed, and this kind of public perception and perception towards your partners from US or from Europe is something that will limit and at least exposure of Chinese involvement.
See, Rike wants to respond.
Oh, just adding, well, not maybe respond directly to Adam, but I think from my feeling is that in Iceland, there's a difference in discourse when it comes to just trade with China or Chinese investments, because people, my feeling is that people are generally positive towards trading with China, but FDIs are very sensitive. And we had the case of a Chinese billionaire wanting to buy land in Iceland, and it's one of the most controversial political issues for the past years. So that was not popular, and people are suspicious of Chinese foreign direct investments, but open to trade.
Right, okay, there's actually a question on this precisely, so maybe you can stay on. So you mentioned the Icelandic government has yet to take a position on the BRI. So what's the general public discourse? You already touched upon it, but maybe you can elaborate a bit.
So when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative specifically, before the Vice President's visits to Iceland, it was almost non-existent. People really did not know what he was talking about, the general public at least. And there is little discussion in general about foreign policy issues in Iceland. For example, we had elections past month, and foreign policy issues were almost not discussed. A bit about the EU. So there is some discussion about the Belt and Road Initiative in academia, a bit in the media, but generally people are not thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question for our Finnish speakers here. So Finland's marine government has taken a more outspoken position on human rights in China compared to its predecessors. Lisa, it's directed to you. Do you foresee any gradual changes in government policy or Sino-Finnish relations? So you feel free to take it, but Adam, if you want to add anything, just jump on it.
Yeah, I do think there is a gradual change taking place. Like I mentioned, the new governmental action plan reflects this change, and it has a much more alarmist tone even than like previous China action plans have had. I think the change in policy is due to the big change in sort of the global dynamics, but also I don't think the change will be huge. Like I said, we have a long tradition of cautious foreign policy, and that doesn't change quickly. So it's sort of in our DNA to practice foreign policy that way. Marin, the Prime Minister Marin had that very outspoken tweet about Xinjiang, and the president was a bit upset about that because he is a more moderate sort of person in this sense. So I think the discussion is a bit polarized. I think we have the moderates like the President Minister, and then we have perhaps the younger generation, or just like, I would say perhaps like more radical political parties, Left Alliance, the right-wing populist party. They are very sort of anti-China in some of their statements. So it's polarized. Yeah.
Adam, would you like to add anything to this? Or?
No, Lisa covered that quite well. I think this kind of I don't know, strategic ambivalence will be there for the years to come.
Do you think that's going to work out in the long run, to be strategically ambivalent?
We don't know what is the long run. No? I think also we have to remember that that the whole context is that I mean, China is a slightly under Xi is a different country than it was 10 years ago. And I think 10 years ago, when you think about it, there was kind of, I think from year to year, you had kind of, I don't know, at least it felt like there's that kind of Chinese reputation is better and better, at least in Finland, or that was the feeling, definitely. And that has changed. That has changed. And what happens in 10 years when it comes to Chinese own policies, whether we have what kind of happens in the relationship with US. This is, I think it makes a lot of sense for Nordic countries to, and I mean 99% of countries on the planet do the same, to kind of be ambivalent and not to take clear sides.
Yeah, I definitely didn't mean to put you on the spot here, but I thought I'd ask a follow-up question. You all mentioned indigenous communities at some point. Maybe you can elaborate on the interplay between indigenous communities and then the whole, the broader picture of Sino-Nordic relations, because I think this tends to fall off the cliff a bit when you talk about Arctic security. So if anyone has a take on this, then please.
I can see what I was talking about. So if anybody else wants to start. So I think the problem, one problem is when it comes to kind of direct relations between Chinese officials and indigenous people representatives. The Chinese officials, when you talk with them, at least people, well, it's different, of course, for Chinese Arctic ambassador. So with anybody else, there is this feeling that China doesn't feel comfortable kind of interacting with kind of actors within states, apart from business, when they have kind of state interlocutors. So I think it's maybe related to internal concerns also. One thing that however, at the same time, one thing that we have to remember, China is actually very strong, has been over the last, 20, 30 years, quite a strong supporter of indigenous rights internationally. China, of course, makes a reservation that indigenous rights arise only from Western colonization and history of Western colonization, so they completely don't apply to China. But in Arctic context, China clearly supports indigenous rights and recognizes indigenous peoples as as indigenous peoples within international law, and China has been organizing indigenous meetings, kind of UN meetings. So there is kind of the government formal position is quite open to indigenous to cooperation with indigenous peoples, but you don't really see this. You don't really see direct interactions. I think the biggest problem, especially for many indigenous communities, a big concern is the behavior or the performance of Chinese actors or Chinese investors, and there are obviously not that great examples from some parts of the world, and especially for indigenous leaders, they interact a lot with kind of indigenous peoples globally within the UN. So they do get this sort of input about not very well done dam project in Ethiopia, or kind of small things with mining. So there are kind of concerns about the behavior of Chinese economic actors, and China does behave, and Chinese economic actors also behave very differently in different parts of the world, depending on the local regulations, governance levels, corporate governance. But I think the concerns are there. And for example, when I was kind of many years ago interviewing some indigenous leaders about Chinese involvement, one thing that came up, there was a moment when Chinese government, or not government, sorry, Chinese mining companies were quite interested in Canadian extraction, and not much of that actually kind of came to fruition. Like a lot of actually Chinese plans and investments in the Arctic, most of them are actually just dissolve after a couple of years of discussion. So in that case, one of the reasons why many Chinese companies decided to not to be involved in several projects is they were complaining that there's just too big burden of this kind of community consultation, the impacts and benefits agreement. This is just too much. This is too much to deal with, and that's for many indigenous kind of leaders, this is a bad sign. This is a bad sign because this kind of framework created around the Arctic for dealing with indigenous kind of concerns and the impacts. This is something they cherish so much, and something that they still think is not sufficient in most parts of the Arctic. And having kind of Chinese companies saying that this is too much is a concern. So I think there is a little bit of this dynamic there. But saying that, kind of in the Arctic Council, for example, when it comes to this kind of intergovernmental level, it seems that Chinese presence hasn't really changed anything for primary participants.
Lisa, would you like to add anything?
No, I actually think Adam really raised the most important points there. Yeah.
Great. Then let me quickly ask, since we're talking about Nordic Sino relations and their interests together, what do you think is the prospect of the Nordics getting maybe closer together in the future? I mean, we now see that Finland has a closer relationship to China than maybe Sweden and Norway do. So what do you think is the dynamic going to be in the short term on the Nordics cooperating on China in the region? And maybe also in light of the EU's new Arctic white paper. And I mean, I guess there's also interest of other countries like Germany coming closer to the Arctic. What do you think are we going to see in the next few years maybe? Is it going to be a clash between actors that are not necessarily Arctic states, or do you think are we going to see a more comprehensive approach to Arctic security from a Nordic perspective?
If I may, well, I think the Nordic countries will definitely continue their dialogue, as they are really active in doing and sharing information regarding China and security. I think it was published by the Nordic Council of Ministers, a report conducted by former Icelandic minister, where China was addressed in the Arctic context. But still, the Nordic countries are different and they have different interests. So they might not want to have a unified China strategy. I'm not sure if that's the way to go, but I think they will definitely keep the dialogue going.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? Yep.
I also think that the dialogue will be maintained and possibly even enhanced. I actually don't think we're so different after all. We have sort of shades of gray, but we're not so different. We ratified the same treaties and we're kind of on the same boat anyway. And I mean, Norway has actually come closer to Finland's stance recently after like the Sino-Norwegian relations were normalized. I think probably Sweden is the most radical voice right now, but I mean, I don't know how that will develop in the future. What I was actually thinking when I was listening to Ricky's speech, I was thinking that, like I said, Finland and Iceland should somehow bond in terms of engaging China, because Iceland has done a lot to sort of promote the idea of the global Arctic, and Finland has this history of sort of balancing between the great powers during the Cold War. But also, I'm not sure if that will happen, because of course there's a bit of competition as well. I'm not sure if our president wants to sort of share that glory with Iceland, and like knowing Iceland's former president, who is sort of the figurehead of this global Arctic, I think he quite likes to be in that position too. So I guess friendly competition would be a productive way to go in this sense. Yeah.
I would just add that I actually don't know. I have no opinion about the future of this Nordic cooperation towards or versus China. But definitely Arctic, like Nordic states, I think benefited in the past from being a little bit different. So that there is kind of, because Nordic states are seen sort of as by many as a sort of a package, which many people up here don't like, I guess. But at the same time, you know, like I think it's of benefit that you at least one or two Nordic states always have a better relation, and then you still have kind of Nordic kind of exchange. We have to remember that, you know, Nordic cooperation is not really about foreign policy, so as such. So I think there is a value there, and you know, this is also true for the EU, that like people complain about, you know, Finland being, you know, too cozy with Russia, kind of after Crimea and so on. But actually, a lot of people do want to have some of the EU member states to maintain better relations when there is like a more tense situation. So there are these kind of channels always open. I think this diversity is actually benefiting the Nordics.
Okay, staying on this very diversity. So both Iceland and Finland, as you all said, have much smoother relations with China, so to say. So Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, they had their sporadic frictions with Beijing on some occasions. How do you think this like occasional diplomatic tug of war, how do you think this is viewed from Helsinki and Reykjavik? Do you see that they perceive this as a burden or as some kind of obstacle in the process, or is it just generally that the foreign policy of these other states doesn't really matter to them? What's your take on it? Okay, Lisa.
I guess, I mean, this is just me speculating, but I guess at least some political leaders in Finland are happy that Sweden is doing what Sweden does best. So I guess it's more like we all have our role to play, and it's good that that Nordic countries express different opinions. But I do think that the Finnish business community certainly views this as a burden, because like I said in my presentation, what happens in Sino-Swedish, Sino-Norwegian relations certainly has an impact on the way Finns think about China collaboration and the way China thinks about us too. So, and in some ways, I do know that China has sort of intensified its collaboration with Finland and Iceland, because it has sort of lost its friends elsewhere in the Nordics. So it has all these dimensions.
I'm not sure if if the government views this as a worry or a burden, but of course, they would be following this closely and want to remain in close contact with all parties, and of course don't want this to escalate. But I'm not sure.
Adam, would you like to add anything?
No, I completely agree with Lisa when it comes to this. You know, how you can see it in the kind of the sort of media discussions that kind of Chinese presence in anything Chinese happening in the Nordic context is much more visible than Chinese presence in Africa or like in the media or for the public perception. So this is clear that I think that, for example, the Nobel Prize sort of mayhem, I think it has affected the kind of Finnish opinion about kind of Chinese foreign policy, let's say, and its tools, and more than anything else that China has done. I think more. I would, when I talk with kind of regular people, kind of in a small town here, I think it's more kind of important than Hong Kong or Taiwan even somehow in some people's perception. So I think there's a clear connection here.
Thank you very much. Just coming back quickly to the Arctic Railway project that seems to be dead for now. Or have there been any efforts by government officials or private investors to engage with or like reassure the Sami community in some way? I mean, Adam, you mentioned that you spoke to Sami leaders at some point. Maybe you have a take on it, but Lisa, also feel free to add.
Maybe Lisa wants to start, or I can also.
Go first.
Well, the project has never been really likely. It's always been problematic. I think, of course, we had a huge discussion for a long time about different options and how to reconcile the concerns of reindeer herders and the environmental concerns. You know, the problem with the Finnish railway is not only the building of the railway and whether it's economically viable and why do we really need it. The problem is that, for example, for the Sami and for many people who are kind of who have kind of, I would say, environmentalist approach, Arctic Railway is an opening to huge mining activities in northern Finland. That's the point. So it's not only about this one project. It's about what it could open, what sort of economic activities it could make more likely. It's not necessarily the case, actually. The mining executives will tell you that it doesn't matter, but it is sort of perceived like this. And here in Lapland, in the regional council, the regional plan has been kind of discussed for the last couple of years, and they've been putting the railway in and back from this kind of regional spatial plan, and finally it was gone. It's out for now. So it was impossible. It was just impossible to reconcile these different values. I guess if the Arctic Railway had very kind of strong economic benefit, that it would be clear that this makes sense, the discussion might have been different. There would be more pressure. There would be, I don't know, more incentive to somehow mitigate the concerns, but for many people, there's just not enough stake in the Arctic Railway to go into conflict with the reindeer herders, with the Samis. It's just not there. And these kind of private plans for the Arctic Railway, I don't know. These are really weird. For me. The announcement when they were saying that they will kind of try to limit the impacts by building tunnels and putting the railway on on the pillars, and just imagining the costs, and you're in the middle of taiga and you're doing these tunnels, and it's just so unrealistic. So anyway, but I think I'm 100% sure that this will in 5, 10, 20 years, this project will be back somehow on the agenda. I'm quite sure.
All right, Lisa, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I was actually just recently writing about this, and they're one of the private investors that have been linked with this, possibly most notably, is Peter Vestepakka, who used to be not the CEO but development manager of Rovio, the company that made Angry Birds, and he is a known like China enthusiast. And basically, he organized a hearing with the Sami community on this railway project. And according to media reports, he was shocked by the response. So he kind of felt that he was tortured in that hearing. So I don't think they found good dialogue there. So basically, I don't think there is really anything that could make this sort of project more suitable from Sami community's view. It just sort of cuts through the land that is part of their traditions, and for them, it's just Arctic failway, as they call it. So yeah, but basically, I even felt sorry for the man for a while when I was reading that, because basically, I think that in Finnish media, he is now often sort of represented as the evil capitalist who sort of wants to bring Chinese tourists to Finland and take them to eat expensive king crab in Norwegian coasts, and then there are the locals, the Sami community that sort of receive all the sympathy from everyone, of course. So it is becoming this sort of devil angel story in a way. So yeah, it's interesting.
All right, thank you so much. Speaking of devils and angels, there's the COP26 coming up. So going over to climate change, what's the view from the Arctic Council on COP26? I mean, China just recently released a climate action plan, and the Nordics seem to be keen to engage with China when it comes to environmental protection. So what's the Arctic Council going to be looking at when it comes to COP26? Adam?
I can say something. Well, our Arctic Council has been quite good in not interacting that much with the UNFCCC negotiations, so that the Arctic climate change, some magical way, could be kept separate from the global climate change. So one of the biggest emitters, or one of the biggest, those among the biggest emitters who are in the Arctic Council, can actually discuss climate change and adaptation and impacts and all sorts of stuff, and then do whatever they want in UNFCCC. I do think I think there is kind of, you know, when you think about Arctic Council, you know, as a kind of combination of states, so it's one thing, but also when you think about people involved, the experts, the people from the ministries, there is a genuine concern. We are talking now about, you know, the Arctic warming 3 times the global rate, and it seems that 2.7 globally is now what the current policies are taking us. So for this region and for the biodiversity, for when you think about people's livelihoods, it's a disaster. So of course there's a clear, I think the message from the Arctic Council, like Arctic Council as a kind of knowledge gatherer and kind of, I don't know, communicator of common understanding of Arctic challenges, is that this cannot work for this region. 1.5 doesn't really work for this region properly, but you know that the current kind of level is just not there. At the same time, as you know, there is not like we have a kind of a new, I would say, we have a new level or new kind of dimension on the discussion about sort of Arctic and climate change. You asked earlier about this EU new communication on the Arctic and this kind of controversial aspect of basically banning imports of new resources or of kind of resources coming from newly opened exploitation sites. Finland, in its Arctic policy from this year, basically has the same position. Fossil fuels, new fossil fuels in the Arctic are incompatible with Paris Agreement. And EU, my point of view is that EU make a mistake by kind of not saying that this kind of Arctic import ban is kind of should be just basically a part of that we shouldn't have any new resources being accessed. So I think here you have this kind of you have this linkage also to China, to the declaration of not investing in coal plants abroad, which is also, you know, this is also like no new fossil fuel projects approach, and I think the Arctic as a kind of region, as a kind of symbolic region, may play a role in this kind of in the developments toward this discussion, whether we really can manage as humanity without new hydrocarbons, without new fossil fuel projects, and you've seen the reaction from Russians and Norwegians, which were not enthusiastic, and here we also have the question of the role of gas. It's also a huge discussion that we need to deal with in Europe. You know, the European Commission President, 1 week after announcing the communication, again said, which basically says that we shouldn't have any new gas projects in the Arctic, said that, you know, brought up gas again as a transitional fuel. For China, gas also is partly a transitional fuel, and I think this is a kind of the topics that will be coming up in kind of in the Nordic context, in the EU context, also in the Chinese context when it comes to climate change.
All right, Lisa or Rike, would you like to add anything?
Not really. I think it was a good answer and reflected the Arctic sort of stand very well.
Okay.
Not maybe on the Arctic Council per se, but I think Icelanders, as all the other Nordic countries, are very worried about climate change. When it comes to China, Iceland has been working on geothermal energy projects, for example, with the Icelandic company Arctic Green Energy, so making this whole new city basically, which is only run on geothermal energy. So there are some positive projects on the way, but we are going way too slowly.
Yeah, I guess right now it's we have to wait for the COP to come out with the actual decisions. So and I guess this also wraps up our webinar for today. So I would like to thank all the 3 speakers for your very insightful presentations, for a very exciting discussion. And I guess we'll have to reconvene at some point to talk more about it, because this is going to be a long-term issue. So thank you again, and thank you for the audience for asking very good questions. So I wish all of you a really good day, and thank you again also for the KAS for being a great support. So have a good day, and yeah, don't freeze if it's cold where you are.